And of course, woe betide that gay man who never bothered divorcing his wife because, he didn't plan to marry Bill. So what does it matter if they are still technically married? Well, again, for purposes of day-to-day living, it probably doesn't matter. But Bill may find himself in a very sticky situation if his partner dies without a will. The wife may come back, guns blazing, saying, "I'm the wife and I'm entitled to everything. And get out of this house. It belongs to me, not you."
Hello, I am Celia Sanka, Executive Director of the DiversityCanada Foundation, the organization that brings you GoldenVoices.com, the website where seniors meet to focus on matters of importance to seniors. At GoldenVoices.com, we have the Fireside Chat series where we speak with experts under the theme of living longer and living well. Today we will be focusing on matters of interest to the LGBTQ community as they age. Members of the community, there are in particular legal issues that have significant implications for LGBTQ seniors. We're quite pleased to once again be speaking with Dr. Douglas Elliott, and we'll speak a bit more about that, who is a partner at Cambridge LLP. He has been practicing law for close to 4 decades, having been called to the bar in 1984, and he has been involved in significant cases that have pushed the legal agenda in Canada. He is the best person to be speaking with on this topic because he has made significant gains on behalf of the LGBTQ community, and we'll speak a bit more in depth on that. Doug, welcome today again.
There's
a second reason. There's a second reason that you are one of the best people to be speaking with on this, because you mentioned the last time we were speaking that you're almost there to being senior or to
right.
Claiming the title of pensioner, I guess.
Yes, I'm just a couple of months away from my 65th birthday, and I'm already starting to get messages from governments and insurance providers and others about how my life is going to change when I turn 65. I must admit, it's a lot more complicated turning 65 than I thought it was going to be. So I have a lot more sympathy for seniors than I used to.
Any thoughts of retiring?
Well, I hope so, but I think like a lot of seniors, part of it is about whether I'm healthy and able to continue to contribute, and then trying to find that, make sure that when I retire, that I have sufficient financial security, and also that I have plans to stay active. I want to make sure that I keep my brain active. I think for any of us who have been professionals or active in business, it can become problematic when you suddenly go from being a very busy professional person to not having a full schedule. I saw that actually with my own husband when he retired from teaching. He was so anxious to get a break that he sort of came to a crashing halt, which was great for the first month or so. And then by Christmas, he was bored and wished that he had done more to plan activities for his retirement. So I'm hoping not to repeat that mistake.
That's something that we hear a lot when we have discussions with seniors, that the transition from the world of work, that active life, to retirement, that does take some planning, because you think that it's going to be wonderful to have nothing to do, and then you're looking for something to occupy your time, to be very busy. So Douglas, I mentioned that you are Dr. Douglas Elliott. That's because you received an honor, a rare legal honor, something that only about 4 in 57,000 lawyers in Ontario receive per year. And that was the Doctor of Laws degree that was conferred by the Ontario Law Society. Is that correct?
That's right. On June 23rd of 2021 is when I received it. And you're right, this year there's only going to be 4 lawyers in Ontario who will receive this, and I believe that I am the first openly gay man to have received this honor. So it was a proud moment for me personally, but also I think a proud moment for our community to have someone recognized who's a member of our community and recognized for the work done advancing rights for our community as well.
And you were quite humble. You expressed great humility on the occasion of receiving the award. I was looking at the statement that was in the newspaper, and you had mentioned, if I can quote a bit here, that even when I was in law school, I still would never have dreamed that the Law Society would think it was a good idea to honor a gay lawyer. It just would never have occurred to me that they would think that that was a good thing. Tell me a bit more about that sentiment that you expressed, because to me it reflected the history of the way that the struggles that the LGBTQ community has had to just be accepted in society.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is something that especially younger Canadians lose sight of, who have lived in a world where legal rights are guaranteed, that all of us LGBT seniors have grown up in an era when we were not accepted, where we didn't have legal rights. When I was born, in the 1950s, it was a terrible time for gay people. It was a criminal offense. You would be, if you were a lesbian, you could be denied immigration to Canada. You were officially denied employment with the federal government. Canada was extremely hostile to LGBT people. And that really didn't start to change legally until 1969, when Pierre Trudeau made his famous comment about the state having no place in the bedrooms of the nation. But even then, it was just a very modest change in the law that made it lawful for same-sex couples to have sex as long as they were both 21 and in the privacy of their own home, and it was only 2 people. So that helped a lot of people, but when I met my current husband, I was only 20 years old. So technically, what we were doing in the bedroom was a crime, even though if I had been a girl of 14, it would not have been a crime. So we grew up in an era where the law treated us as criminals, and some of us actually experienced the bite of the criminal law. In fact, when I was in law school in 1981, the infamous Bathhouse Raids happened. And it was the largest mass arrest in Toronto's history up until that time. And people in February of 1981, when it happened, we went out into the streets and marched to protest. But I knew that at the time, because there was no human rights code protection, the legal profession was deeply discriminatory in a number of ways. Didn't like women, didn't like people of color, didn't like gays and lesbians. And there was, at least women and people of color had the ability to go and file a human rights complaint at that time, but gays and lesbians did not. So I knew that if I ran into problems that I might never have a job. and that was a reality that I grew up with. And then, of course, the charter came along and things slowly started improving. But the 80s was a terrible time because that's when the AIDS epidemic hit. And we were very, gay men in particular, because we were the ones who were contracting HIV, our lack of legal protection really became profoundly obvious. People couldn't go and visit their partners in hospital. When someone died, there was no pension available for their partner. If there was no will, the family would swoop in and seize control of the body, the assets, and everything else, and the partner would be kicked to the curb. I lived through some pretty horrific experiences dealing with those fragile people, those vulnerable people, all through the 80s. And it was only in the 90s when things started to improve, when we started to, we got better treatment for HIV, people started living longer, legislators slowly started changing their tune. The city of Toronto finally grudgingly recognized a parade permit for the Toronto Pride Parade, for example. That didn't happen until the 90s. And then we started getting protection under human rights legislation. But for a lot of these things, we had to go to court. I went to court many, many times.
And we'll talk in depth on that.
Sure.
Look forward to it, yes.
Yeah. So, we are a generation, it's sometimes referred to as the Stonewall Generation, because we were a generation that always had to fight back. We were always pushed around, and we always had to fight back, which has been, in some ways, invigorating. But psychologists have done studies on this, and it shows people who have endured a lifetime of discrimination, whether they're gay people or other kinds of oppressed minorities, you feel a trauma. It actually shows up in your brain. The structure of your brain physically changes from having to deal with that lifetime of trauma. So it marks us. It really does mark us. And it even creates problems within our own community, because often older LGBT folks feel disconnected from the younger generation, in part because commercial ventures like bars have always centered around younger people who drink more and spend more, but also because, the experiences of those young people are so vastly different from what we went through. And lots of times they're just oblivious to it. Not all of them, but lots of time, they don't learn about it in school. They rarely hear about it in popular media. And so they just sort of take for granted that the way things are now is the way they always were, which of course is not true at all.
Yes, you touched on so many important points, and we will be going into many of those areas more in depth as we speak this afternoon. So yes, the seniors, the LGBTQ seniors of today had to fight and had to endure a great deal of oppression, and that, as you say, does mark them. But you were part of the move. You made some significant inroads in making legislators then take up the challenges and move things forward. I want to look at 3 high points in your legal career that made a significant impact. There's so many, but there are these particular 3 that I'd like to focus on. One is the Purge class action, the federal government Purge class action. The second is the constitutional case with respect to same-sex marriage, and the third is the CPP survivors pension. So if we take the first one, this is something that seniors today, LGBTQ seniors of today, would have had to grapple with in the 1955 to 1996. Workers in the federal government were persecuted, they were fired and forced out because of their orientation. And you had a significant victory for the community with respect to that issue. Tell us a bit more about that.
So the whole process of the federal government's policy began during the Cold War era. There was a belief at that time that gays and lesbians were more likely to be communists and to betray their country, and also a belief that gays and lesbians were of weak moral character and were easily susceptible to blackmail by foreign powers, and therefore they couldn't be trusted as federal government employees. In fact, that never happened in the entire history of Canada, so it was a completely unscientific policy. It was based on ignorance and stereotypes and not based on any actual evidence. But it became a powerful policy that was driven by the RCMP and pursued by the RCMP with relish for many decades. In fact, they actually went to the extent of, in Ottawa, because that's where a lot of people went to work for the federal government, they would actually go out and try and intercept gays and lesbians in the community to catch them in bars or parks or at parties because they wanted to identify them. This was the big thing, identify them so that they could be put on a list and kept out of government employment in the first place. And this did happen sometimes, that people actually never made it into federal government employment because the RCMP tipped off the employer. And as you mentioned, this carried on right until the 1990s. The final case was brought by a woman named Michelle Douglas, who was a lesbian who was working for the military police, and she decided to fight back and was successful. In fact, at that time, it was no longer, of course, the Cold War was long since over, and it was no longer fashionable, shall we say, to discriminate against gays and lesbians. And fortunately, there was a courageous prime minister in the person of Brian Mulroney who stood up to the RCMP and his generals and some of the people in his own caucus and said, this has got to stop. And so it came to an end under his leadership. But still, we had many battles to fight. And even though this is an important point for gays and lesbians today, even though the discrimination stopped in 1996, the people who had been injured by this policy, thousands of Canadians over those decades, had never received any compensation, any restoration, and some of them, their lives had been ruined by this. You know, people who, recruits in the Canadian Armed Forces who had been outed to their parents at the age of 18 or 19 years old and sent back to their small towns with their heads hung in shame. Was brutal, caused enormous amounts of PTSD. Some people never, ever recovered from it. Their lives were truly shattered. So we, in 2016, put a proposal to the federal government through an organization called the GAL, Human Rights Trust, to address some of the historical injustices done against the LGBT community over the years. And this was a key point, was that the federal government itself had conducted one of the most damaging campaigns against our community for decades and had never done anything about it. This led to a class action lawsuit, which was settled in principle in 2018. And in November of 2018, we announced the settlement on the same day that Prime Minister Trudeau stood up in the House of Commons and apologized to the LGBT community for the way we had been treated, especially around what has now been called the LGBT Purge, but for the other injustices done as well. And I was fortunate enough to be seated in the gallery of the House of Commons along with my husband when that apology was made. It was really profound. But the government also entered into a settlement that provided financial compensation to the victims of the Purge, very important. They also are receiving an award, a kind of medal called the Canada Pride Citation, to compensate them for the fact, especially the military and police, for the fact that they were denied the opportunity to get medals for public service and to recognize the injury done to them in the course of their service. There's also a large sum of money, over $20 million, that's been set aside for the use of the LGBT Purge Fund for several major projects, including a exhibit at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights that will be opened in 2024 about the Purge, and a monument, a permanent monument, which will be built in Ottawa next to the Library and Archives Canada building, just down the hill from it, in a lovely spot next to the river. There will be a permanent monument to the struggle of our community for equality through the years. And so it will be a lasting legacy of this class action, and really a gift from the people who were victimized by the Purge to the people of Canada, and will serve as a reminder to future generations of the injustices that have been done to our community.
Yes, so a permanent symbol or reminder that this should not happen again.
We're the first country to do it. We're the first country. The other countries have monuments, but for example, the one in Berlin is a monument to the Nazi persecution of homosexuals. And so it's easy to say, okay, well, it wasn't the German government that did that. It was those bad Nazis that did it. And in this case, we're acknowledging that it was all of us. It was us Canadians who did who are responsible for these injustices. And I should mention as well that the total value of the settlement of $145 million is the largest compensation awarded to an LGBT community anywhere in the world, ever.
Yes, indeed, a truly significant accomplishment there, and you were at the forefront of all of it. Another one that you made significant inroads in this area is the constitutional case with respect to same-sex marriage, and if we look back on it, that can be seen as having, in many ways, got the ball rolling further along the way until the federal government passed the legislation. It got to the point where the legislation was passed finally because of the pressures from that legal action and several others that came along the way. And then same-sex marriage was legalized in 2005. But let's go back to that case that you fought in the Ontario courts.
Yes. So it's interesting. A few years ago, I entertained a visitor from Germany and showed her a documentary about the struggle for equal marriage in Canada. And she was quite shocked. She said, I thought it was easy. I thought you just asked and they did it, because you're nice Canadians. But of course, that's not true. There was quite a struggle. It began, actually, you can go back to the 90s when there were some early attempts to get, early attempts to try and get equal marriage. But eventually, the community started talking amongst ourselves about a strategy. And we first took a case to the Supreme Court called M versus H, which established that common law relationships between same-sex couples should get the same recognition as opposite-sex couples. That was an important building block or foundation stone for the fight for equal marriage. But the Supreme Court of Canada, and that was a case I was involved in, that was a case where the Supreme Court left open the question of whether same-sex marriage would be permitted. And we immediately turned our minds to what to do about that. and a number of lawyers formed a strategy. And the ones in Toronto, I was in Toronto at the time, we decided to bring a case that would involve a bunch of couples who were seeking civil marriage licenses from City Hall. And I agreed to represent the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto, which is a church that has a special mission to the LGBT community, and whose then senior pastor, Reverend Dr. Brent Hawkes, was a very prominent gay activist in his own right. An AIDS activist too, but a gay activist. And so we, thanks to a tip from Professor Kathy Leahy of Kingston, I was aware that we could still marry people under the publication of bans. You didn't have to get a license for City Hall. Anyone who grew up in the Anglican Church, like me, knew about the publication of bans because we old folks, when we were kids, we heard it sitting in the pews, the announcement of upcoming marriage and everyone getting excited. But I found out this was still the law, even though it had sort of wasn't fashionable anymore. It was still possible. So this church published the bans of marriage for same-sex couples. They didn't need to get a license for it to be a legal marriage. And of course, it caused quite a kerfuffle in the media and at Queen's Park. How dare you? And we took the position, well, if the Anglicans can do it, why can't we? The Anglicans won't marry same-sex couples, but we will. We're entitled to our own religious beliefs. Stop us if you can. So off we went to the church on January the 14th of 2001. The couples were married. I think it was January the 14th. The marriage got huge attention, huge press coverage, and it actually moved the needle on acceptance of same-sex marriage, because most people in Ontario get married in a church. And so to see people getting married in a church, it really changed people's minds about the fact that this was, legitimate marriage. But we had to go to court because the government still refused to register the marriage officially. Eventually, we got a ruling from the Ontario Court of Appeal on June the 10th of 2003 that said that the marriages were legal marriages, that the definition of marriage that excluded same-sex couples was unconstitutional, and that immediately any same-sex couples that wanted to get a marriage license should be allowed to marry. Well, that meant people started getting married right away. And of course, there were people who were already married by our church who were legally married. And it was very hard for the government to put the toothpaste back in the tube at that point. The decision was made by Chief Justice McMurtry, who had been, when he was Attorney General of Ontario, one of the architects of the Charter of Rights. And his colleague, Jean Chrétien, was the Prime Minister at the time. So it was a very interesting political dynamic as well between those two men. But we then got the message from the then Attorney General of Canada, Martin Cochon, who made an impassioned pitch to his government that they were not going to fight us anymore, and they were going to bring forward a bill to extend same-sex marriage to all the provinces that did not have the benefit of a legal ruling, notably Alberta. And so we brought a number of legal challenges leading up to the legislation in 2005. There was a denouement that some people may remember, which is that after the bill was passed by Paul Martin's government, there was another election and Stephen Harper was elected. And Stephen Harper, when he kicked off his campaign, he said, the first order of business for my government is going to be to repeal same-sex marriage. But he said, unlike Mr. Martin, I'm going to allow a free vote in the House of Commons. He wanted to come across as being more democratic. He only had a minority government. I think he believed that a lot of people in the Liberal Party were opposed to same-sex marriage, but didn't have the courage to stand up to Mr. Martin. And I think to Mr. Harper's surprise, when he brought in his bill to repeal same-sex marriage, the Liberals and the NDP voted en masse against him, as did the Bloc Québécois. And in fact, several members of his own party voted to leave same-sex marriage in place, and including at least one of his cabinet ministers. So that was the end of that. And Mr. Harper said, if I lose, I will never mention it again. And he was true to his word. That was the end of it. And I was glad, because that paved the way for me to get married, because my husband and I had decided that we were not going to get married until the legal fight was well and truly over. And that was the end of it. So we ended up getting married in 2008. We would have been married sooner, but I didn't realize how complicated it was to get married, booking venues and all that. Our community didn't have a lot of experience with that. Even figuring out what an engagement ring looks like for two men was a bit complicated. But my husband figured that one out. He said, lots of diamonds. That was the solution.
And it turned out to be something of a celebrity wedding from what I understand, with legal luminaries all there, and it made the papers as well.
Yes, it did. Well, that was a controversy for us, because we originally, I had said, well, this is a private moment for us, even though the legal fight was public. And my husband had said, let's make a point of not having any media there, which I had originally agreed to. And then we published my husband wanted to publish the typical engagement announcement in our local newspapers in Elliott, Lake, and Brantford, where we had grown up. And we got such a positive response to that he said, okay, we can have one newspaper and the radio, but no TV. And I agreed with that. And so one of our guests was Frank Iacobucci, who was a former judge of the Supreme Court of Canada. But at that time, he was president of the Toronto Star. So he asked if we would let the Toronto Star cover it. And that's why we ended up with our picture in the Toronto Star, and a lovely story. And that the picture that was taken has been used many times around the world to illustrate same-sex marriage, including I understand, in a popular textbook in Ontario right now. So which is great. I like the picture because it shows my husband smiling. I'm glad he was happy that day. And I think other people like it because I happen to be kissing a female friend of mine. So I think people think it was amusing that here I am marrying a man, and that the picture that gets caught is me kissing a woman behind his back. So literally.
Yes, it's a beautiful picture. And I love your clan colors.
Yes, in fact, I told him I wanted to have a Scottish wedding. I wanted to have the Elliott clan tartan, and he said he would do it as long as I asked for permission from the chief of the Elliott clan personally, which I happened to know her, and I did. And then he added a gloss that she had to tell him that she was giving permission to it. And so she spoke to him and said, I understand you'd like to get married in the Elliott clan tartan. He said, yes. And she said, I would be disappointed if you wore anything else. So it was a very Scottish wedding. And I thought a lovely blend of traditional elements and modern elements that made it, I think, typically Canadian.
Hopefully our producer, Christopher, will be able to get a copy of the picture that we will be able to share with our viewers.
I hope so. He was actually at the wedding, so he was at the wedding, so he better be able to get you a picture.
So the third high point that we will look at in your career is the CPP survivors' pensions. You were the lead counsel in that battle as well? Yes.
So that's the Hislop case. So again, as I was mentioning with respect to the Purge situation, up until the same-sex marriage case, I would say, the main preoccupation of our community in legal issues was to stop the discrimination going forward. But we're not really trying to rectify the impact that these historical injustices had. And one of them, following the M versus H case, the CPP was changed so that survivors in same-sex relationships would get a survivor's pension, but it only was on a going forward basis. So anybody who had died in the past was not getting a survivor's pension. And of course, we lost many gay men to AIDS in the 1980s, and so there was a whole bunch of men who would have qualified for pensions but didn't because their partners were of the same sex. There were women too, to be sure. There's some diseases like breast cancer that are more common amongst lesbians than they are amongst heterosexual women. But the impact on gay men was profound because of HIV. So we started a class action with George Hislop, who was a renowned gay activist at the time, as the representative plaintiff. There had not been a successful constitutional class action in Canada up until that time. And contrary to this idea that Canadians are nice and they just do the right thing every time, we actually had to take that case, first of all, to trial, which is very unusual for class actions. Most class actions settle once they get certified. And we had to take this to trial in front of Justice MacDonald, and we were successful. And she said that all of these gay and lesbian couples ought to have received their survivors' pensions. The government decided to appeal that. It went to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal carved out a group of people and said that anyone who had died before the trial, that they were not entitled to claim, which I thought was very tragic. But the thinking of the Court of Appeal, at least on the surface of it, was that dead people don't have rights. And so if you died without getting your pension, your estate shouldn't be allowed to bring a claim for a breach of charter rights. We went to the Supreme Court of Canada because the government didn't want to pay. And the Supreme Court of Canada unanimously agreed that the Court of Appeal was right and that these people were entitled to their pensions. And at the time, we didn't have a firm figure because everybody had to process their claim, but based on the expert evidence that was given at the trial, we estimated that that resulted in about $50 million being paid out to gay and lesbian survivors, of course, who were all senior citizens. And some of them desperately needed the money, I can assure you, including George Hislop. He was well known, but that didn't make him rich. He was really having trouble getting by, and that pension made all the difference to him in terms of his quality of life. But for many of them, I can't tell you, no other case have I received so many thank you letters and notes from the clients who, for them, it was about recognition of their relationship. That when their partner had died, they'd been told that their relationship didn't count, that the government refused to recognize it as if it was some kind of sordid relationship or illegitimate relationship. It was, when people lose their partners, it is a very traumatic event. It's one of the most, I think psychologists still say it's the most traumatic thing that can ever happen to you in your life is to have your partner die. And for these people, that psychological trauma had been compounded profoundly by the fact that their own government was telling them that their relationship was worthless. So the fact that the court had validated their relationship was uplifting to a lot of them. I think it really, was a moment of reparation and restoration for them. It salved an old wound for a lot of people.
Let's also take a look at that key issue of what happens after someone passes on and the partner or spouse is left behind, more particularly though the partner, because if I'm not mistaken, the rate of marriage among the LGBTQ community is significantly less or lower than in the heterosexual community.
There are no shotgun weddings in the LGBT community. So
Okay, so the last time we were speaking generally on legal matters to take that seniors must pay attention to, and we were speaking about the substitute decision makers. For the LGBTQ community, especially because of the lower rate of marriage, this is a really crucial issue because the substitute decision maker legislation favors spouses and blood relations, blood relatives. So tell us more about why this is a key issue that LGBTQ seniors must pay attention to.
wow, thank you, Celia. I've been beating this drum since the AIDS epidemic in the 80s because back then, of course, now you can fix the problem by getting married, but then you have to actually get married. And a lot of people don't get married. Some young people choose not to get married. And frankly, a lot of people of my generation, they felt, that ship had sailed, that they'd been living together for so many years, why bother? And it's extremely important to do your estate planning if you're an LGBT senior, because it's the one thing you have complete control over. So you get to decide in your will who's going to be your executor and what's going to happen to your money. And when it comes to decisions about your health care, if you do a power of attorney, you get to choose who's the person who's going to make those decisions. When it comes to looking after your financial affairs, if you cease to be mentally competent, either temporarily or permanently, you can choose the person who you want to do it. And that's important for everyone, but it's especially important for LGBT people because we are not, husband or wife is not usually there. Getting the person recognized, unless you can produce a marriage certificate, you are in my experience, you're far more likely to run into resistance if you show up and say, well, I'm the common law partner. Well, how do I know? How do I know you're not just trying to take advantage? And of course, in our community, this is complicated by the fact that sometimes people have concealed their relationship. Sometimes a common law relationship, it's overt, and people know that Mary's living with John. But if Mary's living with Joan, it may be that people think that they're just roommates, or perhaps I've known gay men over the years who actually had two apartments in the same building. They had two separate legal addresses because they wanted to be able to hide their relationship from family members and friends. Well, that may make sense when you're in normal times to some people, but afterwards, if the survivor says, well, we were in a common law relationship, you can understand that they may get opposition from family members who say, well, I never saw you at Joan's apartment, Mary. How do I know? I think you're just a gold digger. You're just trying to get your hands on her money now that she's gone. That's a very important problem. And of course, the other thing that people, I think, sometimes fail to realize, I do this all the time when I'm doing estate planning for gays and lesbians. I always say, were you ever married to a person of the opposite sex? You would be surprised how many gays and lesbians of my generation were married at one time to a person of the opposite sex. And so they often have children by those relationships, and those children have rights under the law. And those rights can be set up in opposition to the rights of the common law partner if they're not married. And of course, woe betide that gay man who never bothered divorcing his wife because, he didn't plan to marry Bill. So what does it matter if they are still technically married? Well, again, for purposes of day-to-day living, it probably doesn't matter. But Bill may find himself in a very sticky situation if his partner dies without a will. The wife may come back guns blazing saying, I'm the wife and I'm entitled to everything, and get out of this house. It belongs to me, not you. I have seen it happen. I've even seen it, and it happens if you don't attend to those things. It's more likely to happen that it happens in the heterosexual context too, I must say, that sometimes people get in a common law relationship with a person of the opposite sex, and they think that somehow the law will recognize the most current relationship and not the married relationship, and it's not true. It creates a mess when people do that. But for gay people, it's especially important because it's pretty common that the former spouse is quite hostile to the same-sex partner. There's still this weird idea that you can somehow turn someone gay. So you get the widow coming forward and saying, well, my husband was perfectly normal until you came along, Bill, and turned him gay. And so I'm entitled to this house because you stole my husband from me. That is, sad to say, it's not an uncommon phenomenon. And on other times, it's just a question of greed, that people say, well, if he was too stupid to keep me from getting my hands on the house, that's his bad luck, and I'm going to help myself. Thank you very much. So it's extremely important that LGBT seniors pay attention to doing the estate planning. And the good thing is that if you do it, doesn't matter if you're gay or lesbian, doesn't matter if you have you've named your same-sex partner as your power of attorney or your testator, the law will recognize their status regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity.
That's key, that the power of attorney, the advance directive, all of these documents must be organized and in place for seniors in the LGBT community. There are a couple of other documents may or may not come into, for instance, the power of attorney for personal care, but it may be necessary for seniors to make special efforts to have these documents or take care of these two areas. One is the hospital visitation directive, and the other is a funeral directive, to ensure that the blood relatives don't bar the partner, the same-sex partner, from either being at the bedside of an ailing senior or, barring the same-sex partner from the funeral.
Well, and this is an important point you're making, Celia, that a lot of people have this idea that if you're quote-unquote next of kin or quote-unquote a blood relative, that somehow trumps everything and that you can take control. I've seen it in my own family, in fact, sometimes, where older people, they think that this is, the trump card, but it isn't at all. But of course, sometimes these types of relatives can bully hospital staff or funeral directors or create confusion, As I mentioned earlier, sometimes the confusion was caused by the person who's in hospital or who died because they've not been honest with their family members about their living arrangements and their relationships. And so, but sometimes it is a situation where the family member knows perfectly well what's going on, but doesn't like it. And so they want to exclude the person. During the AIDS epidemic, I saw this a lot, where we still see it today sometimes with seniors, especially because they're the ones who are more likely to be in hospital or to be at the end of life. It is important. The best thing to do always is to have a valid power of attorney and a valid will. But if you don't, it is important that you document who is your spouse with. If you've lied to the rest of the world, for goodness sake, don't lie to your doctor and your hospital. Make sure that you have it in your chart that your same-sex partner is entitled to visit you. The law makes it perfectly clear that hospitals cannot discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity. If they have it documented in their records that you have directed that, Bill is my same-sex partner or Joan is my same-sex partner, then they will make sure that that person is allowed access to you in the hospital. And they will use that to rebut any efforts by the family to cut off access, which of course sometimes is a practical problem, right? That if I have had this where we've had to threaten to go to court to get access, but I've never actually had to go, because once you make them aware of the law, then it's usually resolved. One of the problems, though, is that some of these facilities, hospitals and nursing homes and the like, they're run by religious organizations. And sometimes those religious organizations are hostile to LGBT people. However, if they're operating in Canada, it doesn't matter what their religious beliefs are. They may be a Catholic hospital and not recognize same-sex marriage. That it doesn't matter whether the Pope recognizes same-sex marriage. It matters that if for the purposes of an Ontario hospital, they must recognize same-sex relationships, and that law trumps any religious objections the administration may have. With respect to funeral directors, again, the problem that funeral directors have is that the person who died is not available to consult. And so they can't verify the relationship or what was intended. And so they will benefit from having a written document that makes it clear who is entitled to attend the funeral and who is in charge. It's actually best for LGBT seniors to pre-plan their funeral arrangements and to make sure that either the funeral home has a copy of the will, or at least they know how to get one. So, for example, they have the name of the lawyer who's holding the will, or they know that the will is in a safe deposit box at a certain place, a certain bank, and that allows them to be able to verify reasonably promptly who's in charge of the funeral. It's very clear under our law that it's the executor who gets to decide what happens at a funeral, and not the blood relatives or so-called next of kin.
Many seniors in the community express fear of being discriminated against in a long-term care facility, or so being discriminated or abused. What can someone who's facing that unhappy scenario, what can they do? How much of a concern is it, and what can someone do if he or she is in that situation in a long-term care facility?
Well, we know from the experiences during the COVID pandemic that there has been abuse of seniors in long-term care homes, not just LGBT seniors, but seniors in general. It is a problem of there has been inadequate funding for long-term care facilities, and there has been inadequate supervision. But for LGBT seniors, it's been an especial concern for two reasons. First of all, because a number of these institutions are run by religious organizations, and some of those religions are hostile to LGBT people. And so they're fearful of going into that kind of environment. For example, the one nursing home here in Elliott Lake is run by an order of Catholic nuns. Now, I happen to believe that would not pose a particular problem here, but you can understand how a Catholic who is traumatized by their experience as a gay or lesbian might feel fearful about walking into a Catholic institution where their whole lives are under the control of that organization. So that's one aspect of the problem. And the second aspect of the problem is that people are concerned that they're going to be surrounded by the very homophobic people who traumatized them in the first place, whether it's the other residents who are straight and are hostile to them, or the staff. And of course, a lot of people are concerned because they know that the staff members are often new Canadians, and they may be coming from countries where it's very probable, in fact, they're coming from countries that aren't as progressive as Canada about LGBT issues. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be homophobic, but the fact is that Canada is one of the most progressive countries in the world on LGBT issues, so it'd be hard to get someone coming from a country that's as progressive as Canada working in one of these nursing homes. And, you know, usually the experience is good, but there is a fear of being thrown into a homophobic environment, of being trapped and unable to complain. There's a fear that if you complain, there's going to be retaliation because you're at the mercy of the institution, its staff, and other residents. And it is true that there are limits on what you can do. You know, because the government, lawyers, courts, they can't be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But there are things that you can do if you experience problems. You certainly should not put up with them. There are routes for you to take action, both with the government regulator, which, for example, in Ontario is the Ministry of Long-Term Care, who supervises long-term care homes and maintains standards. And the other is through legal action, whether it is through a human rights tribunal or whether it's through the courts. But you are absolutely legally entitled to respectful and equitable treatment as a gay, lesbian, trans, or bisexual person who's in a long-term care facility. So my message is check it out before you get in there. Make sure that it is a safe environment for you. But if it turns out that you're having problems with a particular manager or a particular worker or a particular resident, you do not have to put up with it, and you should seek help. There is help available.
That's really interesting, and that's so important that people know that they should stand up for their rights and that there is help out there when they need it. Thank you very much for that, Doug. And thank you for all of the information that you shared with us on this episode of the Golden Years Fireside Chat.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your interest in the issues confronting LGBT seniors. There's more and more of us, and we have special needs that we hope Canadian society will recognize and respect.
I have been speaking with Douglas Elliott, a legal luminary in Canada who has made some very significant strides for the LGBT community in Canada. And we have been speaking about LGBT issues for seniors in Canada. We have been speaking as part of the Golden Years Fireside Chat series, which you'll find on goldenvoices.com. My name is Celia Sanker. I'm the Executive Director of the Diversity Canada Foundation, the organization that brings you goldenvoices.com, the website where seniors gather to focus on issues that are of concern to seniors. Join us next time for another edition of the Fireside Chat. Until then, take good care of yourself. Bye for now.